Disturbing true scary stories. This happened a few months ago. I've been driving for Bolt for a few years now, and I usually stick to late night shifts. The roads are quieter, and the tips are better. But there's a trade-off. Every once in a while, you get a story that sticks with you, and not in a good way. I've always thought of myself as careful. I've dealt with my fair share of odd passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, even came close to being as strange as what I'm about to tell you. I didn't have a dash cam at the time, and that night was the main reason I installed one. It started off normal enough, just me and the odd sounds my car would occasionally make. I've got this beat-up 2005 Audi, but it's reliable as hell. The streets were quite literally deserted, which, like I said earlier, I preferred. Sometime after 2 a.m., I got a request from a convenience store nearby. It seemed harmless at first, but for some reason, I got this weird feeling in my gut about it. You ever get that feeling like something's off, but you can't explain why? That's exactly what hit me as I drove up. Before I even saw the guy, I figured out why I was getting that gut feeling. The convenience store I was pulling up to was closed. All the lights were off, and there wasn't a single car in the lot. As I pulled closer, I saw him. I made sure to drive pretty slowly so I could get a good look at him. He was pacing outside the store, wearing this ratty hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. I'm not kidding about that. There was literally a hole in the sleeve. His movements were jerky, like he couldn't stand still, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he thought someone was after him. If I had to guess, he was on something. I probably should have just canceled the ride and driven away. I even hovered my finger over the cancel button, but I didn't. For whatever reason, I unlocked the doors, and he slid into the back seat without a word. I regretted my decision the moment I took my foot off the brake. Most people either scroll on their phones or stare out the window, but not him. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror, not blinking, not looking away, just staring directly at me. I tried not to stare back, but I couldn't help but catch his eye a couple of times. He looked kind of angry, which was also pretty unsettling. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio to break the silence. I don't even remember which station I clicked on, but the moment the music started playing, he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was deep and a little raspy, and I could tell he was a smoker right away. That kind of caught me off guard, and I jerked the steering wheel a little bit. I resisted the urge to look at him in the mirror, and just did as he said, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I didn't say anything, and we drove in silence for a while. I thought maybe he'd just sit there quietly until we got to his stop. That's what I was hoping for, at least. But then he spoke. I remember the conversation like it was yesterday. He asked me if I ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. That question hit me like a brick. I let out this awkward laugh and said, "Well, I hope not." I was trying to keep it light, but he didn't react. He just leaned back and muttered something to himself that I couldn't hear. Then he started going on about how he used to be a Bolt driver, and he quit because some punk stole some stuff from his car. He was slurring his words a bit, so I couldn't make out everything he said, but I got the gist of the story for the most part. I looked in the mirror once or twice while he was telling me the story, and I realized he was smiling the whole time, which was incredibly unsettling. A normal person wouldn't smile talking about something like that. He concluded his story by saying, "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." That comment was what did it for me. I started thinking about him as more of a threat than just a crazy drug addict. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do about it. I felt my pulse speed up. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was spinning. I glanced at the GPS, focusing on the destination like it was some kind of lifeline. But the guy did not know when to stop talking. He kept babbling about nonsense, some of it concerning, and some of it just gibberish. I honestly couldn't keep up. Eventually, he started apologizing to someone, although I don't think it was me. He began insinuating that he had just done something awful and that he was a bad person. He kept saying, "I didn't mean it," repeatedly, followed by a few frantic, "I'm sorry, S." I didn't respond, worried that he'd do something if I did. I didn't know what he'd done or what he was capable of, but I wasn't about to find out. We were only a few minutes from his stop when he snapped out of his muttering haze and yelled at me that I had missed the turn. I didn't miss it. The GPS clearly showed we were on track, but I slammed on the brakes anyway, mostly out of fear. He demanded that I pull over, so that's what I did. My hands were shaking at that point. I just wanted the nightmare to be over. As soon as I shifted into park, headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. I said a silent prayer and watched as it crept down the road, its spotlight briefly sweeping over my car. The guy in my back seat slouched down like he was trying to stay out of sight. I turned my head and saw him lying almost perfectly flat on my back seat with his eyes closed. I whipped my head back around before he saw me, trying to keep my breathing steady. He stayed in that position for a really uncomfortable amount of time. I wanted to ask him to leave but decided against it. Eventually, he lifted his head and told me I had gotten lucky. Before I had a chance to do anything, he opened my car door and disappeared. I ended up calling my shift short after that. I was shaken up and didn't feel like driving around anymore. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I came across something on my phone that proved how dangerous of a situation I had been in. According to a news article, a convenience store had been robbed on the night I picked up that passenger. It was 2 blocks from where I had picked that guy up. It makes me sick knowing I was inches away from a dangerous criminal who could have harmed me if he had chosen to. I'm a little scared to contact the police about this. I tried to avoid law enforcement for various personal reasons I won't get into. I'm not really sure if my report would even help. Either way, I'm much more cautious about who I let in my car now. I used to live in the city. The urban lifestyle was truly what I had always imagined for myself. However, after an extremely traumatic experience, I couldn't bear even the smallest noises. I began to hate noise in general. My psychiatrist told me I had developed a rare case of phonophobia. You know that pins and needles feeling you get when your foot falls asleep? It's kind of like that, but in my chest, always there, as if my body was bracing for something that wasn't coming. Every car horn or slamming door felt like a jolt straight to my nerves. I couldn't keep living like that. About 3 years ago, I found a cottage nestled deep in northern Europe. I won't say exactly where it was for reasons you'll soon understand, but all I'll say is that it was somewhere in Norway. It seemed perfect. Very few neighbors, no traffic, barely any cell service. What really sold me on it, though, was the lack of noise. It was just me and the peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I thought I might actually feel safe. The cottage itself was small but cozy. To be fair, it was exactly what the listing had promised. You could tell it had been built to last, with thick wooden beams and a sturdy stone fireplace. It smelled like pine and old books when I first walked in. You know, that kind of earthy scent that's almost comforting. Think of one of those old cabin-style lodges for anyone who has gone skiing before. The nearest neighbor lived about a 10-minute walk down a narrow dirt path. I didn't meet her right away, though. For the first few days, I just soaked in the silence. I'd wake up to the sound of birds instead of sirens, and at night, the only thing I heard was the wind brushing through the trees. It was like the whole world had pressed pause, and I could finally breathe again. I did all my work from my laptop, so there really was no need for me to connect with the outside world beyond that. About a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. The cottage obviously had no doorbell, so those knocks were something I'd have to get used to. I opened the door, expecting it to be my neighbor, and it was. It was an elderly woman carrying a basket of preserves, like she just stepped out of a Hallmark movie. She introduced herself as Ingrid and told me she lived about 10 minutes down the trail, which didn't sound far at all until you factored in how dense the woods were. I mean, you could get turned around and they're just looking for firewood. She was in her late 60s, with oddly long gray hair and these piercing blue eyes that made you feel like she could see right through you. She wasn't rude, exactly, more like blunt. She welcomed me to the woods and extended the basket toward me like she was expecting me to take it. I didn't really have much of a choice. She was practically shoving it in my face. I know it sounds hospitable, but her vibe seemed a little off, if that makes any sense. I grabbed it impulsively, but I admit I had never been treated that way by a neighbor before. It wasn't anything crazy, but it wasn't something I was used to. I thanked her as I took the basket, and she looked at me like she was expecting me to say something else. I honestly didn't know what else to say, so I just smiled. She kept staring at me awkwardly, which confirmed my suspicion that this woman didn't interact with a lot of people. Eventually, she spoke. She said, these were her exact words, which I'll never forget. Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe. It wasn't something a normal person would say to someone else. It was like she was reciting from a rulebook. It honestly sounded more like a warning than advice. I nodded, smiled, and turned to go back inside. After shutting the door, I stood there in silence, waiting to hear her footsteps walk away. She didn't walk away for a good 45 seconds, which was probably the strangest part about the whole interaction. Despite the weird vibe, I did appreciate her kindness. She seemed reclusive but not unfriendly, the kind of person who'd help you if you asked but wouldn't go out of her way to pry. I told myself it was nice to know someone was close by, even if I didn't plan on needing her. I didn't even bother looking in the basket. I just set it down in the living room and forgot about it. There was a thunderstorm that night, which is extremely rare for Norway, but it does happen. I lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the fact that the power was flickering every few minutes. Some of you might find that kind of isolation scary, but I actually loved it. For some reason, my brain wasn't freaked out by the natural sounds of the thunderstorm. It was actually that specific storm which gave me that realization. I listened intently to everything outside, and it was, dare I say, soothing. But of course, that peaceful feeling didn't last. A few hours after the storm started, there was a knock at the door that nearly made me jump out of my skin. I say, knock, but it was really more of a banging. It was loud and definitely not natural, like whoever it was didn't care that it was pouring outside. My heart started pounding, and I began to feel that god-awful tingly sensation in my chest. After hesitating for a few seconds, I grabbed the flashlight and got up to check who it was. I looked through the little glass window pane next to the door. It was Ingrid, soaked to the bone and clutching a flashlight. I opened the door, and she spoke before I even had a chance to greet her. She blurted out that she saw someone near my woodpile and that I should know about it. I was beyond confused, but her words were incredibly concerning, and that took precedence. I stepped out onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain, but I couldn't see anything but trees. I asked her if she was sure, and she nodded. Her eyes kept darting to the woods, like she was expecting someone to emerge from it any second. The whole thing was pretty freaky. I kept looking around, but there wasn't much I could make out between the darkness and the chaos of the storm. Before I could say anything else, she told me to be careful and began walking away without waiting for a response. I watched her head back down the path toward her cottage, clearly unfazed by the pouring rain. I stood there until the glow of the flashlight disappeared out of sight, and then I went back inside. The literal second I shut the door, I realized her story was riddled with holes. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was 10 minutes away? She must have been on my property to begin with. Why the hell would she be snooping around my cottage during a thunderstorm? Was she lying? It didn't sit right with me, but marching over to her house in the middle of a thunderstorm was the last thing I was going to do. Still, I had to do something. I locked up the cottage as securely as I could and sat in my room, listening. The storm started to die down after a while, but I still felt pretty uneasy. A few more hours passed without incident, so I decided that it was probably safe to go to sleep. I can't remember exactly what time it was, but sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping just outside my bedroom window. I'm a really light sleeper, so I was 100% positive it was a branch snapping and not something else. I froze in place for a few tense seconds listening. Eventually, I crept to the window, half hoping I wouldn't see anything. At first I didn't, but then I spotted her, Ingrid. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her body angled away from my house. I could tell it was her because her hair was so long and disheveled. I strained to make out more, but being as there was only moonlight to help me see, it was no use. I saw her beginning to turn around, so I ducked beneath the window before she could catch me looking at her. I stayed crouched there for what felt like forever, and I finally mustered the courage to peek again. She was gone. I genuinely didn't know what to do. I hadn't exactly pegged her as dangerous, just weird. But at that point, I was having second thoughts. It didn't make sense. Why would she try and warn me earlier if she was the one poking around? I didn't sleep for hours. I was pretty dead set on just staying up until sunrise. A few hours passed, and I was starting to get tired. As I finally began letting my guard down, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't like the banging from earlier. It was actually kind of quiet. Still, I wasn't going to get up under any circumstances. The pins and needles started up again as I quietly made my way over to the door. I took an inconspicuous glance through the pane and froze in horror. It wasn't Ingrid. It was a burly-looking bald guy with a thick beard. I had to fight every bone in my body not to yell out in fear. The situation instantly went from a 6 to a 10. As quietly as I could, I retreated to my bathroom, locked the door, and called the police. As I was on the phone with them, I started to hear banging on the front door, like someone was repeatedly smashing it with a heavy object. The operator told me help was on the way and instructed me not to hang up. I sat there, more terrified than I'd ever been in my entire life. Eventually, the front door gave way, and I heard it crash open. I genuinely thought I was going to die. That man, whoever he was, started smashing things in my cottage. At least, that's what it sounded like. All I could hear was the sound of glass breaking and wood splintering. I didn't dare make a sound. Luckily, that man didn't seem to look for me because I never heard his footsteps leave the living room. Eventually, the smashing sound stopped, and I was sitting in complete silence again. I had been fighting off a panic attack the whole time. To my surprise, the police actually arrived pretty quickly, but not soon enough to catch that guy in the act. He was long gone. I pleaded with the officers to help me out, but they were downright useless. They did a pathetic search of the surrounding property, but that was it. They wouldn't even agree to search the woods, saying that it was too dense and they were unlikely to find him there anyway. I begged them to accompany me to Ingrid's house, at least, which they agreed to. When we got to her property, my jaw literally dropped. The entire cottage was abandoned. The cops confirmed this and said no one had lived there in decades. I told them they had to search it for squatters, but they told me there was no reason for them to do that. They tried to tell me that there were no clear signs of habitation, so it would be a waste of time. I damn near lost my mind when I heard them say that. I tried to argue, but they more or less told me that living in the woods was a risk I was taking and was not their problem. They left after that, which infuriated me. I obviously moved out of that cottage, but not before spending one more night there. It was awful, but I made it through without anything happening. Things have been good for me since then, but I still constantly think about this experience. Some of my superstitious friends have theorized that Ingrid was actually a spirit that was trying to protect me and that she was really just trying to watch over my property for whatever reason. I don't believe in the paranormal, so I think it's much more likely that two people, her and that man, had been squatting in that abandoned cottage. I just still don't understand why they decided to target me or why Ingrid would bother to warn me if she were planning on breaking into my house. I don't think I'll ever know. My name is Alexander. My girlfriend, Emily, and I met 3 years ago as freshmen in college. We go to Oxford, which has been my dream school since I was a child. Neither of us are from England. Actually, we're quite far from it. We're both from Germany, her from Munich, and me just outside Berlin. I think that's a big reason why we were so drawn to each other. People from similar backgrounds naturally connect for some reason. Oxford isn't a massive university, but most of the student body is originally from the UK, so our being from Central Europe definitely sets us apart. One tradition we've created is how we split Christmas between our families. Emily is well liked among my relatives, so her presence is always appreciated and expected at this point. Since her house is only a 2-hour drive from mine, we decided early on to spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrate the evening, and then drive through the night to her home for Christmas Day. Before meeting her, I didn't realize most families celebrated Christmas on the day itself rather than the night before. Oddly enough, my favorite part of the holiday isn't Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, it's that late-night drive. It's become its own little ritual, something we both look forward to every year. The first time we did it remains one of my favorite memories with her. Because of where I live, the quickest route from my house to hers doesn't take us on a major highway. Most of the journey consists of quiet country roads, just fields, trees, and the occasional distant farmhouse. It's always very late at night when we make the trip, so combined with the secluded route, we rarely encounter any other cars. It feels like the world is asleep, and we have it all to ourselves. Don't laugh, but we always play Ed Sheeran during the drive. His music has been a shared obsession since we met. I know his songs might seem overplayed, but there's something special about singing the lyrics together. It's like we're perfectly synchronized. This past Christmas Eve started like any other. After a warm night with my entire extended family, we packed up my car around midnight and hit the road. The snow was falling lightly, and the roads were deserted, as usual. With the music and heat cranked up, everything felt perfect. That all changed in an instant though. What I'm about to describe is still one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. Probably the most unsettling. I was driving along when the music was interrupted by my phone ringing. I glanced down, slightly irritated that I'd be getting a call this late. It was an unknown number. I ignored it without thinking. Probably a scam call. Those things are constant these days. Emily made a joke about how dedicated those call center workers must be, making calls on Christmas. I laughed in agreement, and that was that. But then, a few minutes later, my phone rang again. I looked down and saw that it was another unknown number, probably the same one as before. I sighed, irritated, but let it go to voicemail. Emily glanced at me and raised her eyebrow but didn't say anything. I tilted my phone towards her to show her it was an unknown number, and she said, "That's so weird," with a confused look. I didn't respond. Instead, I just shrugged my shoulders. The music eventually resumed, and I tried to take my mind off the phone calls, but of course, not 2 minutes later, my phone rang again. I was furious at that point, cursing under my breath as I fumbled wildly for my phone. I snatched it from the console and swiped aggressively across the screen, ready to tell whoever it was to leave me alone. I startled Emily with my sudden movements. Her body tensed up. In hindsight, I probably overreacted, but I was fed up. I barked, "Hello?" into the phone with as sharp a tone as I could muster. I expected the scam script to begin, but instead, I was met with silence. I turned up the volume in my car and immediately picked up on faint static coming from the other side of the line. I was about to hang up when a man's voice spoke. The voice didn't belong to anyone I knew. "Hello, Alexander." I was so shocked I nearly swerved off the road. I couldn't speak. I felt my whole body starting to itch, which always happens to me when I'm nervous. Before I could respond, the man continued. He began reciting personal information, my full name, my address, details about my life that no stranger should know, details that no stranger could know. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to pull over on the side of the road, but I kept driving like I was in some kind of trance. I considered shouting at him but decided anger wasn't the best approach in a situation like this. After he paused for a few tense moments, I finally spoke. I asked him what he wanted in a steady voice, trying to hide the fear I was feeling. The voice paused before delivering the words that made my blood run cold. He said that he wasn't here for me, that he was here for Emily. Hearing my girlfriend's name was about 100 times more terrifying than hearing my own, and the horrified expression on her face told me that she was just as shocked as I was. I blurted out that I didn't know an Emily, that he must have the wrong number. The man chuckled before saying, "She's sitting right next to you." That was too much for me. I pulled over on the side of the road. I had no choice. My hands were literally shaking with fear. I was about to say something when Emily reached into my lap in one fluid movement and hung up the phone. Just like that. I screamed at her, demanding to know why she hung up on a stranger making personal threats toward us. She didn't answer, just looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. I desperately tried to call the number back, once, twice, 3 times, but it never went through. Emily told me to keep driving, which I ultimately did, but not before questioning her. She said she was scared and that I couldn't blame her for hanging up, which I guess was fair. I drove off in silence, but I still couldn't understand why she'd hang up the phone. I don't know whether I was more angry or afraid. Part of me expected that number to call back, but after about 10 minutes, I felt like it was increasingly unlikely. At one point, I looked over at Emily and saw tears in her eyes. She told me she didn't feel safe, which I empathized with. Something in the pit of my stomach nagged at me, though. Emily and I had been through enough in our relationship to know that trust didn't always come easily. There had been little things, white lies, half-truths, moments where I caught her being less than honest. I knew I was being paranoid, though. How could she possibly have done anything related to this? The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't play the music again, and neither of us spoke. My mind was still spinning with a million unanswered questions. Who the hell was that guy? How did he know so much about me? Only my family knew where we were driving that night, and they'd never pull a stunt like this. I was 100% sure of it. I couldn't think of another explanation, though. Even when we finally pulled into Emily's driveway, I didn't feel much better. It's been almost a month since this happened, and I still don't have answers. Neither of our family members were responsible. We asked all of them. Emily swears she's just as clueless as I am, leading me to believe the person on the other end of the phone call had sinister intentions. You might think I'm overreacting to a harmless prank, but I'm telling you, other than our family members, there are no people on earth who knew Emily and I would be driving that night. I've been really tense ever since. I can't help but brace myself every time my phone rings. I know he's going to call me again eventually. It's just a matter of time.